Hello guys, buenos dias, buenas tardes, buenas noches. This is, if I'm not mistaken, the ninth of our online classes. And I hope you recall that um, the last two classes were a review of the conjugation of the regular verbs, right? The verbs that follow a pattern. We reviewed the three patterns we have studied, and then we also did the modal verbs, the verbs you combine with other verbs to modify their meaning, right? Like querer, uh, to want. So I'm reminding you of that because today's topic will require you to have those in mind, okay? So, today's topic is called stem changing verbs. But in order to introduce the topic, I'm first going to remind you yet again of the conjugation of regular verbs so that you guys understand what we mean when we talk about a stem changing verb, okay? So, verbs are the words that we use to talk about actions, right? And uh, the neutral form of the verb, the one that refers to the action without anybody doing it, to the action in general, is called the infinitive. In Spanish, infinitives always end in ar, er, or ir, right? AR, ER, or IR. One of those infinitives is cantar, right? Which means to sing, right? So let's conjugate this verb, right? We know that it is a regular verb, right? Which means that it follows the pattern. So what do we do? The first thing we do, I hope you recall, is get rid of the last two letters, right? So we get rid of the A and the R, we get rid of the last two letters of the infinitive, and we are left with can't, and that is what is known as the stem of the verb. Okay? In other words, the stem of a verb in Spanish is whatever is left after you get rid of the last two letters of the infinitive, right? So that is the first step, getting the stem of the verb. And then what do you do? Well, I hope you remember this. You write the stem throughout in your little table because it's used everywhere, right? And the last step is adding the endings. And how do I know what endings to add? I know that from the ending of the infinitive, right? If it ends in ar, ar, it means it's an adverb, so I add those endings, the ones I learned for adverbs. If it ends in er, then I add those endings. If it ends in ir, I add those, right? So the endings that I add after the stem depend on the ending of the infinitive, right? All of this is review. I hope it's quite clear by now, right? But the one thing that I wanted to emphasize the most was what the stem is. Okay? The stem is what is left of the verb after you get rid of the last two letters of the infinitive, right? Good. So, now let's move on to the actual topic of today's lesson. It's the stem changing verbs. So, in the last table of cantar, cant, the stem never changed. Well, what is a stem changing verb? Well, the very name of what they are tells us what they are, right? Stem changing verbs are those verbs in which the stem does not remain the same. Don't freak out though, it has minor changes. It does not go crazy, it just has some very minor changes. And the rule that follows is very, very important. Please do not forget this. In stem changing verbs, all stem changing verbs, okay? Because there are several types and we're going to study them all. In every stem changing verb, the changes to the stem always apply to all forms of the verb except for the nosotros form. Okay? What do I mean by this? Well, let's take a stem changing verb. One that we actually know already. Querer. This is a modal verb, right? And do you remember what it means? I hope you do. It means to want, right? So let's conjugate this verb, shall we? What is the first step? The first step remains the same. We get rid of the last two letters of the infinitive. And in this case, we're left with quer, right? Side note, please always remember that QU just sounds K in Spanish, right? So you wouldn't pronounce this as square, you would say quer, right? It's one of just two cases in which you don't pronounce all vowels in Spanish, right? QU just sounds K, like a hard C or a K in Spanish. So this is pronounced quer, right? And that is the stem of the verb querer, right? That is what is left of the verb after we get rid of the last two letters, right? But I just told you, querer is a stem changing verb. In fact, it is a very specific type of stem changing verb. It is an e to ie stem changing verb, or if you prefer to pronounce this in English, it is an e to ie stem changing verb. That might sound a little intimidating and confusing, but believe me, it is not. I hope it will become clear when you see this table. Okay? So notice that I am doing something very similar to what I did with the other regular verbs, right? I'm writing the stem and then I'm adding some endings. In fact, I'm adding the er endings, right? Because querer ends in er, so I add those endings. But I'm also adding some very small changes to the stem. We said that querer is an E to IE stem changing verb. Look at the stem. The stem is QUER, right? And I just told you that the E changes to IE. Well, what am I doing? That exactly. In the yo form, for example, which is quiero, right? QUIERO, quiero. What I am doing is writing the stem with the minor change of taking that E and changing it for an IE, right? So the very name of the type of stem changing verb tells you what kind of change you need to do, okay? I have the stem quer, but I change the stem to quier, right? QUIER instead of QUER, right? But I need to remember the rule. I just told you that it was very important. The changes are made everywhere but for the nosotros form. Everywhere except for the nosotros form. Okay? So that's exactly what you have in this table, right? I changed the stem to quier everywhere, but I left the original stem, quer, in the nosotros form. How does this sound? Well, yo quiero, tú quieres, él quiere, nosotros queremos, ustedes quieren, ellos quieren. Okay? What does this mean? Well, the verb means to want, so yo quiero means I want. Tú quieres means you want one person, of course. Él quiere, he wants. Ella quiere, she wants. Nosotros queremos, we want. Ustedes quieren, you guys want. Ellos quieren, they want. Okay? This is what stem changing verbs are. Verbs in which the stem changes. In what way? The name of the group of stem changing verbs tells you how they change. The first one we're doing is the E to IE group. Okay? So the E in those stems changes to an IE, and everything else remains the same. Okay? Now, I want to remind you of something that I already mentioned, but in the complexity of grasping this for the first time, many of you will probably have missed it, right? So let's look at that table for querer again carefully, but I want you to focus now on the other side, not on the stem, but on the endings side, right? OSE, hemos, en. What endings are those? You know them. They are the endings for the er verbs, right? For the er verbs. How do I know that those are the endings I need for querer? Well, exactly in the same way that I know this for any other type of regular verb, right? From the ending of the infinitive. The ending of the infinitive is querer, ends in er, so those are the endings I add. What am I saying? Basically, I'm saying that stem changing verbs always use the standard endings for their type of regular verb, right? There are stem changing verbs that are adverbs or adverbs or ed verbs, okay? AR verbs or ER verbs or IR verbs. So the endings I get from the ending of the infinitive. And then the change in the stem I get from the name of the group, okay? For example, querer ends in er, so right here I'm showing you I'm using the er endings. But calentar, for example, which means to heat or to heat up, right? It's an adverb. It's an E to IE stem changing verb, and it's also an adverb, right? So how do I conjugate this? Well, let's do the yo form, right? Calentar, right? I get rid of the AR, so I'm left with calent, right? Then I add the ending for ar, for yo, which is a no, right? Calento. But the E changes to IE. I still need to do that. So yo caliento. Not yo calento, but yo caliento. I heat up, right? This actually sounds like a word that some of you might know. Caliente, which means hot, right? It comes precisely from there. And it's caliente, not calente, because it also comes from the stem changing verb. Okay? So this is what stem changing verbs are. And this is the first group of stem changing verbs that we're studying. Let's look at two more examples of E to IE stem changing verbs, right? Two other verbs that have the same type of changes in their stem as querer or calentar. The first one is a very important one, I would argue. Entender. It means to understand, right? Look at the table. Look at what I did with the stem specifically, right? I just applied the rule we just studied. I took that E, right, from entender, and I'm changing it to an IE everywhere except for the nosotros form, right? So all those places that I marked in purple, though in those places I'm applying the rule. Why am I not applying it for nosotros? Well, because that's the exception, right? That's the one place where I don't apply the rule, right? And then the endings. What endings did I use? Well, the er endings, because entender ends in er, ends in er. So those are the endings I used. Okay? So it goes entiendo, change in the stem, and then ending, and same thing for the rest. Entiendes, entiende, entendemos, no change because it's the nosotros form, but I still use the standard ending, and then entienden, entienden. Yo entiendo, tú entiendes, él entiende, nosotros entendemos, ustedes entienden, ellos entienden. ¿Entienden? I just ask you, do you guys understand? Right? And I changed the stem because that's the way a Spanish speaker would apply the rule, right? Another stem changing verb of the same group, the E to IE, mentir. A very important verb as well, right? Sadly, it means to lie, right? So it is an E to IE stem changing verb. So again, notice I'm applying the rule. I'm changing that E in the stem everywhere but in nosotros, right? Everywhere except nosotros. So instead of ment, it's mient. The only form that keeps ment, the original stem, is the nosotros form. But notice that I'm adding endings that are slightly different. Well, why? Because mentir ends in IR. So I use the ir endings, right? That is why it's nosotros mentimos instead of nosotros mentemos, right? Because it's an ir verb. I hope you don't find this too complex. That is, it is a combination of many things we have studied, right? A combination of the basic conjugation pattern, which we should know by heart by now, right? And a combination of all the endings, right? And I hope that for those who study the modal verbs, who follow the recommendation of the last video, you already know how querer works. So in fact, that will have helped you because you already know how this group of stem changing verbs changes, because querer is an E to IE stem changing verb. So this group of verbs is actually the biggest group of stem changing verbs in the Spanish language. There are tons of these. I'm not going to give them all to you, of course. And luckily, since this is the online version of the course, you don't need to learn them. But I'm going to give you a little vocab for your illustration, and I'm going to pronounce them. Atravesar, it means to cross or to go through. So actually, atravesar la calle means to cross the street, right? And it's an E to IE stem changing verb, so I would say yo atravieso, not yo atraveso, right? I changed that E for an IE, right? Cerrar means to close, right? Yo cierro la puerta, I close the door. Comenzar means to begin, right? Yo comienzo el semestre, I begin the semester. Nosotros comenzamos el semestre, we begin the semester. Notice that for the nosotros form, I did not say comie, right? I said come. I did not add the IE because that is the one form in which you don't change the stem, right? Entender means to understand, we just did it. Gobernar means to govern or to rule. Mentir, we just did, also means to lie. Negar means to deny. So yo niego means I deny. Perder means to lose. Preferir means to prefer. Sentir, very, very, very important verb, to feel, particularly for Spanish speakers, right? That is the topic of the day. Probably more important even than the specific rule for this group of stem changing verbs is your understanding that these verbs exist, okay? And that basically the way that they work is exactly the same as the other regular verbs except for those minor changes in the stem. My experience is that Spanish 101 students, once we introduce the stem changing verbs, there's always some confusion because we introduce the groups of stem changing verbs one after the other, and after a couple, it's very easy to forget to which group a certain verb belongs. So you end up making changes in the stem that are not supposed to be there, right? I don't find that to be that serious of a mistake, honestly, because those things are polished, once you move on in your study of Spanish is if that is your intention, right? And also, typically, Spanish speakers will understand you even if you're not changing the stem correctly. So, what I care the most about regarding stem changing verbs for Spanish 101 is that you know they exist and that you know the basics of how they work. Okay? That the stem changes slightly, and above all, that it changes everywhere but for the nosotros form. And of course, that you use the standard endings. Okay? Ar, er, or ir, depending on the form of the infinitive. So, for example, looking at this short vocab list, atravesar, what endings would I use for that? Well, ar endings, right? Entender, what endings do I use for that? Er endings. Preferir, ir endings, right? So that part does not change, right? And that is why it's so important that you know those endings by heart. Okay, so for the activity, it's fairly simple. I'm just going to ask you to take two of these verbs and conjugate them. Of course, two verbs that we have not done, right? So please don't do querer. It's not in this list, but it's the one we used to introduce the topic. And please don't do entender, and please don't do mentir, right? But you have several options here. Take two of those verbs and do the little table, conjugate them for me. And as always, I receive any format you prefer. You can send it to me on an email. You can send me a Word document. Some people have been sending me links to Google Docs. That's acceptable as well, or just a picture with your phone, right? Whatever works best for you. Okay, thank you guys. Please send me the activity as soon as possible, as well as all other activities that you might still need to send me. And gladly, I can report that I have every midterm for this class, except for one. So that one person, you know who you are, send me the midterm, please. Gracias. Hasta luego. Ciao, ciao.